Okay, well, I'm going to make a start, and hopefully some people will come in and catch along, but obviously there will be the recording available later if people are interested to look at that. And it's exciting for me to think, 28 years ago when I started teaching, I couldn't imagine that at this point I'd be talking about learning English in virtual reality. But I suppose, particularly the last year has changed all of our conceptions of how content and lessons and ideas can be delivered. And I think that was partly the prompt for me to explore virtual reality. Perhaps the way that we've been delivering lessons in the last year and a half didn't always completely satisfy me as a medium for interactive and engaging lessons. And so we began to explore the possibilities of whether virtual reality would be an alternative. And the pictures that you see on the front of these of my presentation, these come from a course that me and my colleague Laurie taught in virtual reality a few months back to some Japanese students, and I'll talk a bit more about that later. But it was a fascinating experience for us, and it led us to really think about what are the opportunities and what are the challenges of delivering lessons, and particularly English language lessons in VR. And I want to talk about that and explore that in more detail during this presentation. Please feel free to ask questions in the chat, and I've got it up in front of me, so if I spot anything I'll try to respond to that, but if I miss it I'll try to catch up with it and answer it later as well. I'll also share a link to the slides at the end if for whatever reason you miss something or want to look at it again. Okay, so to get started, just to give you a brief overview of what I'm going to be talking about today. Firstly, I just wanted to sort of try and define a little bit what we mean by virtual reality. That's not meant to be patronizing, because I think most people have some idea, but I think it's a very loose term, and when you read sort of the literature about VR, it's sort of fairly ill-defined, and a lot of things are encompassed within that concept. So I want to sort of narrow down a little bit the definition of what we're talking about here. I want to talk a little bit about the current state of VR. Again, people's experience of using VR varies considerably. Some may have used it many years ago, some may be using it currently, but I just wanted to contextualize and talk about where we are in terms of availability of VR, price of VR, how easy is it to access for both teachers and students. I just want to dip into the literature and talk a little bit about where are we in terms of language learning and VR. What does the research say about this? What are the affordances? What are the opportunities and the potential challenges for delivering English in VR? And then I go into a bit more detail about the course that we personally delivered a few months back, and give some information about that, and show some short clips and examples of the lessons that we taught, and that may hopefully give you a clear idea of what a VR lesson might actually look like. And at the end, what did we take away from that experience? What was our research? What were our reflections about that? And what does that say to us about the opportunities and challenges for delivering lessons in VR? So, like I said, feel free to pop questions in the chat as we're going through, and I'll try to respond to them where I notice them, or I'll catch up with that at the end. Okay, let's first start really by talking about what we mean by virtual reality. And I think I want to sort of narrow it down a little bit in terms of what we're not going to talk about necessarily today. Because I think when you read the literature about VR, it often encompasses quite a lot of different things. And one thing, it encompasses what's sometimes described as virtual worlds, or sometimes virtual learning environments, which is a bit confusing to people in the UK because that's the same as a learning management system for us. But these are these worlds that you can access through your computer, and you can play through an avatar, and there's lots of different things you can do there. The classic example is something like Second Life. Are people familiar with Second Life, or are aware of its existence even if you haven't used Second Life? It was very popular, maybe 10 years ago. It's still going, and it's still popular. Yeah, virtue, like you say, Sarah, virtue is a very sort of confusing term, and these things like Second Life and things like alt space as well, which again you can access through the computer. These kind of social virtual worlds where you can interact with other people. for the moment, I want to sort of leave those aside because that's a much bigger topic, and that would include probably computer games and various types of online games that people play. So what we're going to focus on particularly in this session is really focusing on virtual reality as accessed through sort of immersive headsets. And you can see some examples of what we're talking about here. Again, those headsets range in the way they look and the price and all of these kinds of things, which I'll come on to in a moment. But this is where you wear some kind of headset. You may have some kind of controllers. Got some examples here of these controllers. And it sort of combines these two images to your eyes to make one sort of combined 3D image and 3D world that you can interact with. Now, in terms of where we are with VR, again, it's for a long time VR was the sort of domain of the geek. It wasn't something that was readily available to everyone. It was only sort of within reach of people, perhaps with particular access or with a particular amount of money. However, I think since around 2014, VR has been commercially available for people to go into shops or buy online. So I wanted to just give a little overview of where we are with headsets and the quality of content that they're able to deliver. I think the sort of earliest forms of VR that most people were familiar with were things like Google Cardboard, maybe the Samsung Gear VR, where you fitted in your phone into the device and it would provide a sort of a 3D experience or a virtual experience for you. Again, I'm not sure how many people experienced or used those. They were quite common at conferences, and people would bring one out and sort of show it to you, and they were relatively cheap. And the thing about these, they were very cheap. You could get them as cheap as sort of, for the Google ones, they were $10 or $5 in some cases. Often they were given out free to people. They were wireless, so you could kind of do it anywhere. It was very easy to sort of quickly stick your camera inside that, or stick your phone inside it and have a quick look. It was fairly limited in what you could do with it, although it was a sort of an immersive environment that you kind of look around and see things. There wasn't that much you could do within that. Often it was something you would use occasionally, and it was often for sort of experiences like looking at 360 pictures or watching sort of 360 video. Okay, now I guess you just received some Google Cardboard. So it was fun. I don't think people use them very often. It did make you feel quite nauseous. I mean, the quality of the image was quite reduced, so you didn't get a massively kind of immersive experience, and it did cause that kind of cyber sickness that a lot of people have. Shortly after that, a couple of years later, about 2016, we began to see much higher end devices coming out, and things like the HTC Vive and Oculus Rift and devices like this, and these were much more powerful. You can see an example of one there. They were very expensive, unfortunately. You're looking at several $1,000s because you had to buy the headset, but also you had to have a reasonably powerful computer to connect them to as well. And often there'll be these various peripherals and accessories you had to use with them, these sort of little sort of tripod-y things with cameras in them. It was quite an elaborate setup. We needed a lot of space in your house. It wasn't wireless as well. I don't know if you can see in that picture, there's kind of cables running everywhere from computers and from the controllers into the headset. So it was very sort of cumbersome and quite precarious situation to use it. Again, people may have used these. Not many people owned them. I certainly tried one at a museum once, and exhibitions you might have a chance to play with them, but it wasn't the province of most people simply because of the price. However, they were incredibly immersive, and the quality of the image and quality of what you could see was fantastic, and still is, largely because the image was coming through the computer itself. And was particularly good for things like games. They were great for gamers who wanted to play various games in VR. And now, I think we've got to a situation now where we're looking at devices which kind of combine the sort of better elements of both of those. And I think VR is really becoming commercially viable for a lot of people, whereas it probably wasn't in the past. We're beginning to see devices like this. This is a device called the Oculus Quest 2. There's been the Oculus Quest and the Oculus Quest 2. I've got one myself. I can hold that up here for you to see. And these are much more accessible, easy to buy. They are affordable, not very cheap, but within a range where people might have a go at, think, well, I'll try that out. They're completely wireless. They don't need cables of any type. Everything is contained within the headset itself, so it's not like the devices where you have to stick your mobile phone into it. The actual headset contains all the computer power inside it. And for that reason, it has pretty decent immersion. Perhaps not as good as some of these really high-end, powerful devices, but really sort of good enough to experience things in a way which is engaging and motivating. And so, you can enjoy both sort of games and experiences of a wide variety of types. And these devices are really like mobile phones in the sense that I think they do have the sort of the power roughly of a quite a powerful mobile phone. You can download apps to them, and there's a whole variety of games and apps that you can download, and some of them are experiences, some of them are for watching videos or whatever. To give you an idea of the kinds of things that people do with these devices now. And like I said, these are becoming increasingly popular. People play sports games in there. I think particularly over the last year with coronavirus, this has been a godsend for many people to be able to do some of the activities they normally did, but in a virtual environment. People can attend conferences and lectures in VR. We haven't been able to go to the cinema for so long, and yet VR can provide a sort of a simulation of sitting in a large cinema with a large screen in front of them. Fishing, if you want relaxation and calm, fishing is possible. Again, fitness, gyms and things like that have been closed. It's been liberating for many people to be able to use their VR device to box and train and do various things. And there's a lot of creativity and options to create within VR as well. So different types of painting apps and 3D modeling and these kinds of things. I don't think it's always easy to capture this in a screenshot. So what I did, I created a little video. I think I'll actually bring the video up because it may not run so well on my screen. Let me just pull that up. Let's just get that. Here are some examples of I recorded this through my headset itself. I'll play this. You can see some examples of different types of activity within VR. So this is sort of fishing in VR. You can see quite authentic, quite immersive, quite realistic. I did quite well there. This is kind of exercise as a boxing app where you can practice your boxing.
Let's get into beast mode.
Again, things like sports, and again with all of these, you're quite active. You're stood up. You're using these controllers as sort of devices to interact with who you're playing, whether that's table tennis. Here we've got some examples of something a bit more creative. This is a sort of a sculpting or a 3D sculpting act. I'm not particularly creative, unfortunately, so I think my son's probably a bit better at this stuff than me. And this is an example perhaps of like a virtual cinema. So you've got the screen, it's a bit dark, but you can see I'm sort of sat in this sort of large area with what seems like a very large screen in front of me. Okay. Let's just go through that 1 second. And inevitably, like with mobile phones, because language learning is such a big part of many people's lives, there have been attempts in VR to provide language learning opportunities, and there have been various apps that have done this. A reasonably recent one is something called Mondly, And again, these are more like self-study apps, though something perhaps akin to something like Duolingo on your mobile phone, in that you sort of do it by yourself as a student. You watch kind of pre-recorded sort of little clips, or interact with AIs and answer questions, and there's sort of multiple choice and things like that. So it's very much a sort of a self-study opportunity there. But I've tried them. That they're interesting. That they're limited in what they can do, particularly in terms of how high a level you can go, because there's a point where it sort of the more complex language becomes quite difficult to represent visually. And there have been lots of attempts, I think, through some of these social apps. There are a lot of social apps available in virtual reality, where you can kind of meet other people informally and talk to people, strangers and people you know. And they've also been used for language learning, sort of language exchange, even some sort of informal classes in some cases. To give you an example, there's an app called VR Chat. It's very popular. And again, there have been opportunities for language learning in there. Rec Room, you can see an example there of someone who's set up a kind of a classroom in this app called Rec Room. I think they're learning Chinese there. And Altspace is another one which you can access in VR. There have been English lessons as an example of there's a man I know who successfully sort of teaches lessons there. Unfortunately, these are not really designed for language learning. So to be able to set up classes or to deliver lessons in them requires quite a technical level of knowledge of the application, and so it's not really realistic for the average teacher who may not have a great sort of technical knowledge of these things to be able to set up classes there. So it's very much sort of a niche area for people to work in. So from my perspective, when I looked at what was available in VR, I didn't really feel there was anything that, from my perspective, because I was interested in, how can we, because over the last year and a half we've been teaching in things like Zoom and Meet and Blackboard Collaborate and Teams, and I think there were limitations to that, and we were looking at ways to expand that or find alternatives for online delivery for students. And then I think, about 6-7 months ago, maybe a bit longer than that, I found out about an app called Immerse, and there's a couple of people I think from Immerse in our chat today, and this was a very interesting app in that it was specifically designed for language learning, and it was specifically designed so that teachers could deliver lessons with not a sort of a high technical knowledge, and it was user friendly for both. So the students would be sat in VR or stood up in VR using one of the Oculus Quest headsets, and so they're sort of fully engaged through that. The teachers, however, are not in VR. They're sat at their computer, and they're able to interact through the computer, through the software on computer. Now, I think the thing that I really like about this software is that it is designed to be sort of user-friendly for teachers, and there's lots of features which help you kind of replicate things that you would naturally do in a classroom, whether that's a face-to-face classroom or an online classroom. And again, just so you get an idea, again, sometimes screenshots can only give you a little bit of the picture. I'm going to just let me just show you the Immerse app, and so this is what the teacher would be seeing from their perspective. So this is sort of the welcome area that students would start in, and there's various little guides there, or sort of introductory elements to show them how to do things, but I'll ignore that for now and just show you sort of the key elements here. At the top, I'm clicking on this sort of location thing. This is perhaps the key thing to allow you to move between different locations, and this is where the sort of the situational element of VR is so interesting. And you can see here there's all of these different possible locations that you can go through. So if we go into somewhere like an airport departure, you can see here we've got this sort of representation, and I can move through this area here. Okay, there's the sort of classic security here, and you can see the potential there for role plays and sort of situational dialogues that would really be, I think, engaging for students. Let's go to a few others. Okay, go to a bar. Again, something we've been denied for a little while with coronavirus. And you can begin to see sort of elements within the locations which are kind of user-friendly for teachers. So for example, you can see up here there's like a screen, and this screen can be used as a sort of a whiteboard if you want to enter text. You can add like a YouTube video if you want to access some sort of listening materials or instructional videos. Or if you wish, you can put in your presentation slides. And in this case, they do need to be from Google, but you can put in sort of public Google slides and do a presentation from there as well. Okay, let's just move us around a little bit to different places. Okay, again, you know, really sort of good perhaps for functional language for students and situations they're likely to be in, you know, such as either a hospital or a doctor's, and allow for very sort of specific language to be practiced and looked at. You know, a really interesting one. So most of them are kind of locations, but we found this really interesting. This what's called an observation deck, which allows us to insert sort of 360 images so that students can you know, see different places. Just to give you an example, just bring up some of those here. So let's say we want to look at Paris. Ooh, let's bring that up again. 1 second. Let's try another one just for now. Oh, there we go. There's Times Square for you. Okay, so here we can pull up 360 images, and again a great opportunity for sort of dialogue and conversation with students. And there's a whole range of these images you can bring up. Some to do with places, some to do with locations and common everyday areas. Again, a slightly different experience though, but I think a fascinating one, and you know, does suggest potential endless possibilities if you can upload your own images as well, which you can. You know, that you know, the possibilities of sharing images from anywhere in the world, you know, from your hometown, from the student's hometown, it's tremendous possibilities there. Okay, let's just go to one and just show some of the other features that are available for you. Okay, so this is a nice one, obviously for role play. It would be a sort of a fast food context here. And you can see there are sort of interactive elements within these locations. So you can see here we've got this nice sort of wheel here. And as a teacher, I can sort of turn the wheel on and, you know, I can put in different perhaps questions. Okay. And you can see, if I just move out the way, you can see that's on the wheel there. I could fill that wheel up and we could spin that around. No, it's not going to land on food because I've only got the one there, but if it landed on the word, then the question would pop up on the screen. Again, nice opportunities there for sort of group work and chatting as well. You know, so there's a whole variety of sort of interactive elements within the locations. And then down the left-hand side here, you will also see a variety of sort of buttons that you can click on, which bring up, you know, useful sort of lesson-related features. One is to do with sort of gestures. As a teacher, obviously, you can't really gesture so easily within the location, but you can use these to, you know, greet people or clap, you know, sort of question. So there is some sort of, you know, fairly basic gestures that you can use to interact with the students. You can also change your character, and you can see from this button here. So if you're in a particular situation, so here I'm in a fast food restaurant, would make sense I sort of moved into the fast food employee. Okay, and again, so then again, either me or the students could sort of interact with the thing. You can see a lot of stuff is interactable. You can click on things and print out a receipt there at the end, or a bill for them to look at. So very nice one to sort of set up role plays for students. various other things here on the left. You can bring up your video, rather like here I could bring up, like in Zoom or Meet or something, you can bring up a video of yourself. So maybe if you do need to do perhaps some pronunciation work, I'm not going to do it here because it puts quite a strain on the computer when you do it, when you're doing several other things at the same time. Several other things you can do here. There's a button there which is called Rally, which allows you to bring all the students to the same place. So if the students are dispersed around the room doing some group work or something, you want to bring them together, you can just rally them and it will automatically bring them to the same point that you specify. This is really interesting. I really like this tool, which are called placeables, which allow you to place items around the room of different kinds. So for example, if I want to have a whiteboard up, I can put up a whiteboard. So if I want to do some incidental language, corrections or something like that, this would be a nice place to do that. Other types of placeables are things like a label. So if you want to label an item or something in the room, okay, you can just do that. So here I can put up the word sort of window to add that there. There are other things you can do. You can do things like an image search. So if you wanted to put up a picture of something, then you can also put up a picture of something. So you can put up pictures of different things, and those could be picked up and looked at as well if you want to. So again, a lot of features which I think are designed specifically with teachers and students in mind, and it doesn't require any additional sort of work on their part to add them to the location. Let's just place that again. Okay, a few other things that can be added. There's a nice little thing called a prompt there, which allows you to send messages to your students. You can send them to everyone. So if they're engaged in group work, you can send them a little prompt to tell them to remember to do something. Or you can send it to an individual from the to option. You can select an individual and then send them a message. Maybe if they're having problems with something, it's a nice sort of discreet way perhaps to do a bit of gentle correction or redirection to individual students as well. This pops up on their kind of wrist in VR. So they'll be in VR, they'll get sort of a little notification on their wrist and they can look at it, and it's just private to them. There's things like a timer. So if you want to set a timer, for an activity or something, then you can set that. And nice again, in classes we often have to do group work, and we want to do group work, and it's sometimes a bit more difficult online. We can use breakout rooms, but here you've got an option to kind of move people into groups to work together, and various options to sort of mute them to each other so they can't hear each other, or they can only hear each other from a distance. Lots of nice sort of fine-grained tools to allow you to do sort of very sort of teacherly and EFL type things with your students. So that's an overview of the software, and this is what the teacher would see. But obviously, the students would be fully immersed and using they'd be using the headset and would either be stood up or sat down and engaging with the class and the other students. Let me just bring up my slides again. So, this made us very, very curious, this software and the possibilities of using it. And, we asked Immerse whether we could use it for some action research, and they were incredibly generous and kind to let us use it for free with students to allow us to carry out this initial research. And I think we had certain questions. We had quite a lot of questions about VR, but the ones that sort of were prominent in our mind were things like, does learning in VR encourage students to speak more freely? We got a feeling that maybe it did. And related to that, does communicating via an avatar reduce nerves and anxiety? Because obviously you're not really, visible. Your face isn't visible. Does it help with reduction of nerves? Particularly under the situation, in the situation with coronavirus, does VR help create a better sense of place than online learning? I think some of the some of us have felt perhaps over the last year or so that, while some aspects of online learning are good, there is not really a sense of sort of being in the same place together, of being a sort of, everyone's in their own little sort of bubble, in their own sort of room or city or place, but there's not that sense of sort of togetherness, and could VR help engender that a little bit? Possibly does VR help them to remember vocabulary and language better, and perhaps does VR help them concentrate better than online or face-to-face classes? And in this world of distractions, concentration is such a difficult thing in classes, especially online, where you've got the next tab is one click away, and if people get bored they can easily click on it. I'm sure some of you have that available now in case. Now, before we embarked on any sort of teaching, we did do a bit of a delve into the research into language learning and VR, and there's not, it's still very early days for this subject because it hasn't really been commercially available for a long time. There's not a huge amount of in-depth research into the values and the affordances that VR can offer. However, there is some out there, and by looking through it, we can pull out what seems to be some of the positive features of VR for language learning. One thing, and you can perhaps see the obvious reasons for this, is engagement and motivation. And there's quite a few studies that show that VR does fully engage and motivate students to study and to come back to classes and to get involved in the lesson. There's evidence that vocabulary recall is improved by studying in VR. There's been several studies that have compared non-VR with VR and people's ability to remember words, and maybe it's that situational use of language and being in the location that helps. This idea of sort of transfer as well, and contextualization, the ability to use the language that you've learned in class or in a lesson, and then to be able to use that in real life. There's some evidence that VR helps with that, and again, maybe because of the fact that you can practice it in the context that you're actually going to use it in, does prompt the brain and make it easier to recall that language when you're in that situation. And again, evidence that VR does help with some reduction in anxiety, and that might be to do potentially with talking through a character who is not you, or through an avatar. In terms of research gaps and some of the issues with VR, I think a lot of it is perhaps to do with the sort of the dearth of, or the lack of research into VR. I mean, I think one thing that comes up several times in research is obviously the fact that VR is a novelty, and certainly until it's become more commercially available, when students were given this, obviously it was something new, something exciting, and maybe some of these things they said about their level of engagement and motivation was more to do with the fact that it was new and it was interesting, it was different from a normal lesson, that made them report that way. So perhaps there's a lack of longer term studies as to what happens when VR is used over a much more extended period of time on a much more regular basis, where it's much more integrated into the classes, and whether students would report the same level of engagement and motivation. And related to that, there really people have identified that there is not a lot of sort of real world studies of VR usage, simply because there's so few examples of VR being part of everyday studies and everyday courses. So a lot of the time the studies are kind of created, or the classes are created to do the research, a little bit like we did to a certain degree, but some cases in much more limited fashion. It might only be 1 or 2 lessons and making a comparison with non-VR. And something we noticed just by working through the research and the literature was how diverse the research conditions are for a lot of the research. A lot of things are clumped under VR, which are incredibly different in terms of how they were researched. So Second Life is clumped under virtual reality, and so when you hear people reporting that virtual reality has this opportunities and is good for this, it's it includes so many different ways of engaging with content, from mobile phones as well, and people tend to talk about virtual worlds within mobile phones. So there's perhaps a lack of sort of strict definition about what is VR and exactly what it is we're researching as well. So I think that's another difficulty, again, with the technology being so young as well. So we were fascinated by the possibilities that VR could offer, and like I said, with Immerse allowing us access to their software, we ran a pilot course, and you can see a screenshot from it there, with some Japanese students, and it was ran over 5 weeks, and it was 10 hours. So it was a couple of hours a week with the students. We had 9 Japanese students, and they were put over 2 different classes simply because of times when they were available. The focus was on speaking, practicing speaking, and of those 9, 5 agreed to take part in the research, and that research involved surveys during the course, and then longer interviews at the end to try to sort of tease out their experience. So it's really kind of action research. Obviously the number of students participating was quite small, couldn't really do any sort of quantitative research, so it was really more qualitative research to try to get as much information from the students about their experience and what they thought about the whole experience of studying in VR. Now, I'm just going to, again, I'll just pull this up, so I don't think it will run very well on the slide, but I'll just pull up some, a clip or a few little clips of lessons taking place. Again, I think it's useful to be able to see actual lessons taking place rather than sort of screenshots. So I've put together a little montage of little clips from lessons, so you get an idea of what, and I haven't sort of chosen the good bits or anything. I took fairly sort of normal bits of lessons, so you can sort of see different aspects happening in the lesson and see different behaviours from students. Let me just bring that up. Where are we? Oh, there we go. Just start that again. 1 second. Okay. Sounds not perfect, unfortunately, but I mean, you can see here this is in a sort of like a hotel resort at the start of the lesson. It's interesting to note the way the students, feel quite free to interact with the environment. You've got a student making himself a little cocktail there.
It's the 4th lesson of the course.
And you can see the use of the sort of presentation slides there.
As you can see, we're going to have a holiday.
Here you can see the students engaging with some of the interactive elements in the lesson, the little wheel.
There are some different activities. What I'd like you to do is, Yuki, could you come and spin the wheel, please?
And notice while he's doing that, the other student, Nahiro, messing around with glasses and hats, which is very common in the classes.
And what does it say?
Fishing.
Fishing. So, do you like fishing, Yuki?
Oh, so sorry. I have never been fishing. So
You've never been fishing.
yeah.
Do you think you would like it?
Maybe I don't like fishing because I don't like waiting. So.
So you could maybe say something like, okay.
Again, here we've got the fast food restaurant. We've got the teacher playing the role of the kind of assistant serving them.
Hot dog and the Coke and fries.
Again, very sort of authentic context for language to be practiced in.
Coming right up. Anything else I can get you? Okay, Yuki, what can I get for you?
Sorry about my poor camera work here. You can see in the background though, like the whiteboard is being used for language reference. So if they need to look at language.
Fries and coffee, certainly. Anything else?
Yes. How much?
That is $9.97, please.
Okay. Can I use credit cards?
Of course. We'll accept credit card or cash. That's fine.
I will talk about.
This last one's interesting. This is in a sort of a presentation scenario where a student's giving a presentation on a film they liked,
I know.
Yeah.
and their willingness to do this perhaps would not be normal in a face-to-face class, but in this they seem quite happy.
No. This movie's genre is anime and human drama. Cast and crew. This anime has a celebrate crew.
Okay. Okay. Okay, so that was an example of some of the clips, and I think you could see some of the sort of ways that the students and the teachers were interacting. On top, I sort of left ones in with the teacher involved, but there was a lot of group work as well, with students working together and working to discuss things, in pairs or in small groups, and work together to solve problems or discuss issues, and was reasonably successful in doing that. Now, in terms of what we wanted to find out from students, like I said, we asked a variety of questions through surveys during the course, and also in a longer interview at the end. We wanted to find out from them, what did they find most surprising about studying in VR? How did this experience compare with face-to-face English lessons they've had? How did they feel expressing themselves through an avatar? Was it different from perhaps talking in a class? Did they feel less nervous if they were presenting in VR than in real life? Do they find them more or less concentrated in a VR lesson than in an online or face-to-face lesson? And do you think you remember more or less about the vocabulary, grammar they studied in VR? And do you feel that the other students better or worse than in a face-to-face or online class? There's a lot of questions there, so we pulled out lots of information from them in these interviews we had with them at the end of the course, and I've tried to sort of group together some of their responses around certain themes or topics that seem to come up regularly from them. I think there was a lot of talk really about sort of a sense of place, and this idea of sort of context and situated learning seemed to really be effective for the students. One of them said, it gave me unforgettable experiences. We can go to many places. The reason why I like the wizard classroom, there's like a Harry Potter classroom in one of the locations, is because the fancy places like this can only be enjoyed in VR. So it's not only about authentic situations, it's about potentially sort of fantastical and sort of incredible places they can go to as well. Again, good experience because of VR. We go to many places. I can use many situations speaking English. So difficult in face-to-face. So lack of opportunities perhaps in face-to-face situations to do that was possible in VR. Again, there's an airplane location for students. So it says the reason why I like the airplanes because I felt like I was traveling. I could learn English conversation, I think, with fun. And obviously, this related very much to the coronavirus situation, that many places they couldn't go in the real world now was sort of available to them in VR. So they kind of enjoyed that element. There was a lot of talk around communication, and we did ask questions. We're very interested with the students whether they felt they were able to speak more freely, feel less nervous or anxious when talking in VR. And the idea that they didn't have to look at other people's faces seemed to be quite a strong one. And again, we're learning a second language, that feeling of anxiety, feeling of judgment, feeling of making mistakes. Some of that clearly disappears when it's done through an avatar, and you're just communicating through an avatar and looking at other avatars. It's more interesting talking VR with other students or with you, the teachers, because it's characters. It's so comfortable because maybe I can speak more in VR. I feel people not looking at me. This was an interesting one because I think this does bring up some of the challenges maybe of VR as well. So this student says, well, I felt comfortable. I speak English without being embarrassed, but sometimes I couldn't figure out the right timing to start speaking, which is true because I think we do rely very heavily on sort of visual cues from people's faces and their body and their hands and things like that. And there perhaps isn't that quite that same range of visual cues and gestures to work out. So there was quite a lot of sort of stopping and starting with conversations like, you go first, no, you talk, and that kind of thing, because we didn't really have that range of gestures to be able to indicate someone should speak. And again, this was an interesting one, a similar idea to what the previous person said. It says, giving a presentation in VR have both merits and demerits. I'm not nervous compared with a face-to-face because I can't see other people's faces, and standing on a VR stage is quite fun. However, what I should speak without gesture is a demerit, and what I can't see their reaction is also a demerit. So I think they're saying about their own ability not to gesture very clearly, perhaps, although you can a little bit with your hands with the controllers, and also not being able to see other people's reactions, I suppose. Is it positive or whatever? And obviously people feed on that a little bit if you're giving a presentation to know whether it's going well or not. So, it's certainly, giving a presentation is much less nerve-wracking in VR, but perhaps you don't get quite that same level of feedback from it. This was a really interesting one, I thought, and this is kind of the flip side of the lack of gestures. One of the students says, one thing I liked was the thumbs up gesture. You can communicate by gesture. That can't be done in Japanese classrooms of frankly environment. Now, I appreciate that may be a little bit obscure what that means exactly, but I sort of teased it out a little bit with the student, and it was really to do with the fact that students can use the controllers to do various gestures. They can press various buttons on them to do sort of like thumbs up, like thumbs up gestures or clapping and things like that. And several of them mentioned this. They like the fact that they're able to do that in a way of sort of complimenting or saying something nice to someone else in the class without necessarily saying it out loud. So if someone says something good or something interesting, you can give them a little thumbs up in a very sort of unobtrusive way. And probably in a face-to-face class you wouldn't do that. So if someone did something nice or said something nice, you wouldn't kind of go, oh, that's well said, or something like that. And certain educational cultures make that difficult anyhow. But in the VR space, it's very easy to just quickly kind of acknowledge what someone's done very easily with the controllers. So it was interesting that he wasn't the only person who brought that up. Lots of interesting ideas about sort of memory and attention. VR is better for sort of remembering new words than face-to-face. I can experience good things and I remember, again, perhaps making that link between sort of the situation and the language that you're remembering. And if it's a positive, motivating experience, then the likelihood is you're going to remember that word or that language point better. An interesting point about concentration is that when you're in VR, certainly from the student's perspective, they really can't do anything else. They can't look at their mobile phone, they can't stare out of the window, so they're fully concentrated, and there are things they can do in VR which can be potentially distracting for themselves and others. There's lots of objects to interact with and things to pick up, and you saw that in some of the clips from the lessons, but they can't really break free from the environment. They are fully in that, and again, maybe that helps them to concentrate a little bit better. And then there is the flip side to that as well, and I think that is where someone said, well, at times I didn't really feel like I was paying attention, and you could see that sometimes in those clips from the lessons where students were much more interested in playing with the objects around them. There may be some peripheral learning going on, but they weren't necessarily concentrating on the teacher or the other students as well. Yes, focus, yes, even if they're throwing things around, yes, I think that's true. So what did we kind of pull out from this? I think there was a lot of reinforcement perhaps of some of the points that we read in the research literature, but it was good to have that actually proved in reality when we're trying it out ourselves. I think from an EFL and an English language learning perspective, the possibilities for contextualized and situated learning are enormous in VR. The ability to be able to put people into the exact context where that language would be used. And I think if you're thinking about, particularly travel and students going to study in other countries, or, traveling on holiday to somewhere, to be able to say, well, look, here you are in a coffee shop, or here you are in a fast food restaurant, here you are in a doctor's appointment or something like that, that contextualized learning seems, incredibly valuable and tremendous for memory and recall. obvious increased confidence and freedom to speak. And we were working with Japanese students, and without wishing to sort of play on that stereotype too much, but Japanese students can be somewhat reticent at times to talk, and that maybe it's to do with educational culture a little bit. But we found that the students that we were working with, right from the get-go, right from the beginning, felt comfortable and confident to talk, and they were quite playful in their language, and sort of teasing us and each other and that kind of thing. And maybe they would have been like that normally, but I think the VR certainly encouraged that, and certainly made them feel more relaxed. And when it came to things like giving a presentation, normally it's like pulling teeth trying to get students to stand up in front of others and talk. In this situation, they were quite happy to stand up and give a brief presentation to each other. Like we said, there's that transfer as well and recall of language. Being able to remember the situation the language was being used in VR, and then in real life to be able to pull that back. It's a lot more difficult perhaps if you learn that in a Zoom room or a classroom, and then try to sort of imagine the situation where that language is needed. Like I said, potentially better peer support and collaboration within the VR room. That we talked about the need for sort of the way that gestures can help people sort of compliment each other, say nice things to each other, to encourage each other, and that seemed a small thing, but I think there is tremendous potential there. Perhaps as software and the quality of the headsets and the images improve, I think there's possibilities for a lot wider range of gestures and ways that they can interact with each other non-verbally. I think from a teaching perspective, I think one thing we found, this really came from the teachers rather than the students, is that there's actually more possibilities for sort of variety and improvisation in the VR space than particularly the online room. I think one thing we've all found over the last year or so is that teaching online requires a lot of planning in advance, and there's not always much opportunity to sort of deviate from your lesson plan because everything kind of needs to be set up and ready to go to give to the students. But in VR, we were more willing to improvise. We were more willing to just go to another location if they were getting bored with something, to go somewhere else and test something out, and try a different activity. And it was relatively easy to do that and to set up little sort of group activities without requiring a huge amount of preparation as well. I mean, perhaps not as much prep as a face-to-face class, but there's definitely more possibilities there for sort of ad hoc improvisation in the classroom from the teacher, I think. It may be to do with how experienced you are as well. In terms of the challenges, one of the things that came up was the lack of facial and visual cues for proper interaction, and some of these sort of meta aspects of language are quite important, in particular in terms of term taking and understanding how people are feeling about what you're saying and reactions to that. And obviously you don't really have that in the VR room, and there are some very basic ones, but not terribly complex. And maybe the software and the technology will improve so that becomes better. But I think at the moment that's an aspect which certainly needs developing. Like we said, ours was a relatively short course. I think longer than a lot of the research that's done into VR. But I think there is the possibility of that novelty wearing off, and whether the introduction of new situations, new locations can stave that off a little bit will be interesting to find out. Whether with lots of technologies, people can have a tendency sometimes to get a little bit tired of it or bored with it, and whether VR can sustain interest from students and sustain interest from teachers and institutions. That's an interesting area to explore and find out. To a certain degree, although, like I said, there is options for improvisation within the VR software, to a certain degree you are a little bit limited by the software that you've got in front of you. And although we were using the software from Immerse, which we thought worked incredibly well and was incredibly well designed for the context and for teaching English, but you can really, to a certain degree, you can only do what's available there in terms of types of activities. So you may want to do a certain thing like, it would be great if I could show my students this, or at times we really wanted things like a browser to be able to sort of search something on the browser and show them something from a website, and again, that might be a limit of the power of the computer or the software or what it's capable of doing, there are times we want to do a certain type of activity, but okay, that's quite difficult. There's no opportunity to do a gap fill or even something quite traditional. So occasionally you wanted to do something, but that wasn't available to you as well. So it's an interesting thing that you are limited to a certain degree by the software. Although there is the possibility for the teacher to improvise and make their own kind of lesson within that. I think related to that really is we do need to start thinking whether there is a kind of a separate pedagogy for VR, and we need to think about whether sort of the task types that can be done in VR are different from what you'd be doing in a face-to-face context or an online context. I think we've again learned over the last year or so that delivering lessons online is not the same as delivering things face-to-face. There are different customs and different ways of doing things that are more or less effective, and maybe there is a need for a sort of a pedagogy of VR about the types of activities that work, perhaps the types that don't, the types of activities that work better in VR. Things like more extensive role playing and things like that would obviously work a lot better in VR than perhaps in an online room or in a classroom. So task types, interactions, so the sort of the pedagogy of VR I think is something that needs to be developed, and quite a few researchers have identified that as an issue. So I think that's for us what we took away from this, but we were very excited and interested by what we learned there, and then actually to the point where at our centre we are going to be offering sort of commercial VR courses for students, and we were fascinated to see what the take-up of this is going to be among students. You can see on our website here we've started advertising this to students. These are going to be sort of general English courses to students to take. So it's we believe there's tremendous possibilities. It's such an early technology at the moment, and it's still very much in its sort of infant phase. So I think there's tremendous possibilities for development, tremendous possibilities for language learning for students, and I think this idea of sort of situated learning and sort of socialized situated learning with interactions and collaborations with other students and teachers. I think the possibilities are fascinating, and we look forward to exploring these in a lot more detail in the coming years as well. There are my slides. Let me just, if that's helpful at all, I've put the link to my slides in there, so if you do want to have a look at that, and that's got the videos and various other things embedded within the slides as well, if that's helpful at all. If anyone does have any questions, I'll be happy to engage with those. I didn't have a chance to sort of check all of them as I was going through. I think people were answering some of them, which was great. But if you do want to, do please contact me if you have any questions about VR. You're interested in VR. It'd be good to sort of build up small communities of people who are interested in this field. Like I said, I don't think there's a huge number of us around at the moment, but access is obviously an issue, and digital divides and who can use it and who can't. That's obviously a bigger issue in education technology generally, but VR is not immune from that either. But I think the pricing of it is coming down, and I think we've reached a sort of a tipping point with VR, in the same way that mobile phones and smartphones went from being a sort of a something for fairly niche into something that everyone had simply as the price came down. And the technology developed. I think we're getting there with VR now, particularly with these cheaper headsets from Oculus. It's interesting. Sarah asked about VR Pro. Yes, absolutely. I mean, I think I didn't feel that at any point. I think there's probably this tendency to sometimes think that there's a sort of infantilization of using VR. It's all kind of game playing. It's messing around with objects and stuff like that. I did not think that at all with the students. They were absolutely the context we were using it in were adult contexts, in the sense that we were in bars and in cafes, and there's possibilities for putting them into situations which are relevant to their lives as well. So I think it could be used for young learners, and obviously there are issues with young learners and eyes and things like that there are concerns about. So I think it works incredibly well with adults. Gary, they will be distance. They won't need to be face to face at all, so they can have these lessons from absolutely anywhere. So thank you very much for coming today. A small but dedicated band. However, the video from this will be available afterwards, so feel free to share on to people you think might be interested afterwards. But yeah, let's continue to explore the possibilities that VR can offer students in terms of effective language learning. And enjoy the rest of your day.